especially by kids, is how do I become an astronaut? So I'm going to explain to you a little bit what an astronaut does, apart from just go to space. We all know astronauts go to space. And I'm going to explain a little bit what it takes as well. How do you become an astronaut? What do you need to be able to do? What are some of the more difficult things of becoming an astronaut? So this is me, because you can probably only see a small picture of me on the screen. I thought I'd give you a big picture, so you can also see that I'm not very scary at all. If you have any questions at the end of this short presentation, I'll be really happy to answer them. So please don't be shy, don't be scared, just ask me any questions you have. So I said before, I'm an astronaut in training, so I haven't actually been to space yet, but I'm training to go into space, hopefully quite soon. But I'm also an astronomer. So since this is the ALMA talk, you probably realize that. So that's my connection with ALMA. I work for ALMA, which you can see up in the top picture, this beautiful image of the antennas that make up ALMA. And I look at stars in my scientific life. So that was kind of my main job before I applied to become an astronaut. And in the bottom, I just share some personal pictures. So I think I've always liked adventure a lot. I really enjoy paragliding and also climbing up mountains. And okay, so now we're in quarantine, but I still like to do sports indoors or go cycling, which we're still allowed to do. So that's just a little bit about myself. So you feel that maybe you know me and you can ask me any questions that you want. So for me, it was always clear, even when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to become an astronaut, because just the adventure of going to space was just the most exciting thing I could imagine. So it was clear for me, I want to become an astronaut. I love space, I want to become an astronaut. And I was lucky enough to actually get there. So I think to become an astronaut, the first thing you need is luck. And I'm going to talk about what else you need a little bit later. But first of all, what does it mean today to be an astronaut? So you may have seen very old films of space shuttles, of people going to the moon. That was a long time ago. So astronauts nowadays, today, go to the International Space Station. And this is the International Space Station that you can see in the image there. So as you can see, it's this big, complicated construction. It is basically a giant laboratory. So the astronauts on the ISS do many science experiments. They live in the station, they eat in the station, they sleep in the station, and it's basically their home for the time that they are in space. And as you can see, the Earth, so the blue thing is the Earth is also in the picture, because the International Space Station is actually not that far from Earth at all. It is only about 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So for those of you in Germany, at least, that is about half the distance across of Germany. So it's really, really not that far. People always think if you go to space, you're a very, very long way away from home, but actually you're not. And one nice thing about the space station is that it travels extremely quickly. So you have Earth here, and the space station just goes round and round and round and round Earth. And it takes it 1.5 hours to go round once. This means that it moves extremely fast, because Earth is huge, of course. So it actually moves at a speed of nearly 8 kilometers per second. And I think that is something that you can't even imagine. But basically, if you can think, maybe it takes you half an hour to walk to school, then if you just blink your eye, you would be there if you were in the International Space Station. That's how quickly it travels, unimaginably quickly. So, as I said, the astronauts these days, they go to the International Space Station. That's at the moment the only place that astronauts go. So what does an astronaut do in space on the International Space Station? What do you think? Probably you're thinking something like this. Generally, it is always believed that astronauts fly rockets, and you have to be able to fly a rocket to be an astronaut. That used to be true with the very, very early rockets that didn't have computers or big computers in them. You did have to fly the rockets. But these days, the rockets are completely automatic. So there are big computers in the rockets, and the control is done automatically by the computer or from the ground. So as an astronaut, actually, normally you don't need to fly the rocket. unless something goes very wrong, which we hope will not happen. So if you don't fly the rocket, what do you do? So these are some activities, and here you can also see a close-up of the space station. Astronauts go on spacewalks. So on the left, you can see the astronauts just hanging off the side of the International Space Station. And the reason astronauts go for spacewalks is not just to have fun and get some exercise, like you might do on Earth, but it is to fix the ISS. So the same way that you might fix a lamp at home because the bulb is gone, you also have to fix the ISS from time to time because things break, parts become old and worn out, and you need to do maintenance. And in order to do that, you have to get outside of the space station and go on a spacewalk. And that is one very important thing that astronauts do. So the other main thing that astronauts do is here on the right. Astronauts spend most of their time on the International Space Station doing science experiments. So they do all kinds of experiments, from growing their own lettuce, for example, which apparently is very good, to studying how the weightlessness, because of course in space, when you're on the space station, you are weightless, so you just float around. So they also examine how weightlessness can affect the human body, for example. There are many, many different science experiments, and basically the International Space Station is one giant laboratory for all kinds of different science experiments. But of course, astronauts don't just work, because they are also human beings. So they also have to eat. And you can see what that looks like here. So here you can see we don't have gravity, which is why everything is floating around. And the astronauts are enjoying a delicious meal of tortillas, I believe. So actually tortillas are a very, very frequent and well-loved snack on the International Space Station. And you can see them preparing and eating it. So what else do astronauts do? So the same as on the Earth, astronauts have to keep fit. And in fact, astronauts have to keep even more fit than you do on Earth because we don't have any gravity. So if you're just sitting upright in your sofa, maybe watching me here, you think maybe you're having a rest. But in fact, your muscles in your body are still working because they're holding you upright. So actually on Earth, we're doing sports and exercise all the time without even noticing it. But in space, because you don't have gravity, as you saw, everything was just floating, we don't need to use our muscles very much. So if you don't do any special exercise, that basically means your muscles just shrink. And when you come back to Earth, you can't even stand up anymore because all of your muscles will have gone. So in order to come back to Earth and still be healthy, astronauts have to do a lot of exercise. So on the left there, you can see an astronaut on a treadmill. So he's just running. But of course, because he won't be heavy on the treadmill, he has to be in a harness. So he's kind of putting the weight of the harness onto the treadmill, and it feels to him as if he's running on the ground. And that's one form of getting exercise on the space station. Then, of course, the best activity on the space station is taking selfies with the Earth, watching the Earth. And one thing that you might not think of if you're cleaning your room is that it's actually very good astronaut training, because astronauts, of course, have to keep the space station tidy. So they have to tidy up everything. They have to clean every Saturday, maybe quite similarly to what you have to do at home. So unfortunately, even if you go into space, you don't get around tidying up and cleaning up after yourself. But it can also be fun to be in space. It's not all tidying up and working. So you can see here, some astronauts even play football in space, which is of course a lot more fun because the ball just goes all over the place. So if I've now convinced you that you absolutely have to become an astronaut, you may be wondering, so how do I become an astronaut? Who can become an astronaut? And basically, there are three, not so easy, but three ways of becoming an astronaut. The first one is, as I said, there are many science experiments on the International Space Station. So if you're a scientist, like I am, for example, you have a good chance. One other thing you can be is a pilot. So in the earlier space travel, a lot of the astronauts were actually pilots because they still had to fly the rocket. So now, as I said, we don't have to fly the rocket, but actually pilots are pretty well trained to react well in emergency situations, to keep calm, to think very rationally, to be very organized. So actually there are a lot of pilots that are also astronauts. And if you think, well, but I can't be a scientist, I can't be a pilot, it's too hard. Well, the other option nowadays is you just need lots and lots and lots of money. So unfortunately, you need really a lot of money, somewhere between 50 and 100 million US dollars. So that's not just something you can get for your birthday, maybe. You really need a lot of money, but right now there is space tourism. So that means you can pay to go on holiday in space. It's just a little bit more expensive than your usual summer holiday. So now I'm going to do a little test with you. So I think this is going to be mostly for the older kids because you need to know numbers. So basically, this is an original test that I had to do when I was doing the astronaut selection. And there are going to be 2 rounds. In the first round, I'm not going to tell you too much. The only thing is, because I can't see you, you have to promise me to not cheat. Because normally I do this and I watch the audience, so you can't write down the numbers. The idea is that you're going to hear a sequence of numbers and you have to remember as many of them as you can. Okay, are you ready? I am going to play the numbers.
8, 9, 5, 1, 2.
So I will let you think a bit about that. So who can repeat the numbers to me backwards? Because that's what we were asked to do. So hopefully some of you will remember that the last number was in fact a 2. 1, 5, 9, 8, right? Okay, so now that you know how this works, you always have to repeat the numbers backwards. I'm going to do a more difficult exercise. So this was actually just a test run, so you understand how it works. And now I'm going to show you an exercise that we actually had to do during the selection process. So I'm going to play another list of numbers. This one's going to be a bit longer. And you always have to remember that you have to say the numbers starting backwards. So the last number that I say, you have to come up with first when you give your answer.
10, 5, 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, 1, 3, 7, 4, 8, 6, 6, 3, 1, 7, 9, 3.
Oh, that's it. So I'm sure all of you remembered 3. I'm sure some of you surely remembered 9. What's the next one? 7. So did anyone also get the 1? The 3? Or even the 6? So this is kind of the limits that most people can remember. And actually, this was meant to scare you a little bit because even astronauts can't say all of these numbers. So they can't remember all of them.
1,
Oh God.
2.
It started again. You weren't meant to do the exercise again. So this is just to get an idea of what kind of tests we have to do to become astronauts. So this was used during the selection, and this is the kind of stuff that you need to be able to do if you want to start training as an astronaut. But don't worry, you can really train for these kind of exercises. So at the beginning, when I saw this the first time, I was like, oh my God, I'm never going to manage this, never, ever, ever. And actually, if you practice a lot, it's a bit like with school, if you practice a lot, in the end, you'll actually understand and get better at whatever it is you have to do. So this is the kind of what the brain needs to do. So now you know whether you have the right stuff in your brain, in your cognitive abilities, but do you also have the right stuff to stand, for example, this? Yeah. This was actually part of astronaut training. I had to have my blood taken, and actually we have to do a lot of medical exams as astronauts. So you really have to get used to having your blood taken, to getting injections, to going for medical exams and so on. So if you don't like medical exams, you better get used to them. And it gets worse. So what I even had to learn, and this is actually part of the training, I had to learn to take my own blood. So can you imagine doing that? Can you imagine taking your own blood? If you can, then you're still in. Then you get to do some fun things like walking around in actually very uncomfortable astronaut costumes, looking like the Michelin Man. This is actually more difficult than it looks because the suit was also quite heavy. And if you're still not scared, you get to go underwater in this suit. Of course, you get a mask and you get oxygen so you can breathe. You're diving underwater, but basically you have to be able to dive and do all kinds of tasks underwater as well. Because of course, in the water, you don't have gravity. So it's a little bit like being in space. And that's what it looks like if you're having fun in your spacesuit underwater. One other thing that you really shouldn't have is too much of a fear of heights, because one thing that is part of the astronaut training is learning how to fly yourself. So I actually loved this because I like flying anyway. As I said before, I also go paragliding, so I love being in the air. But you have to basically become a pilot and do a pilot's license. So you should get used to maybe looking out of the window if you take a plane and just getting used to the idea of being high up. And finally, so the final thing that helps if you want to become an astronaut is if you don't get sick too quickly, because this is also a part of astronaut training. We go on so-called parabolic flights for training. And you can see here, this is just a normal plane. So I'm not flying that plane. I couldn't fly that plane. And what the pilots are doing is they're doing a special maneuver that is called parabolic flights. And you can see the plane goes very, very steeply up. And then all of a sudden it starts going down, making this kind of a shape, which is called a parabola. But the name is not important. What is important is that the plane is flying this shape and that in the top part of the shape, you're weightless. So in the top part of the shape, it's as if you were in space. And what that looks like on the inside, you can see here. So for me, this was actually the coolest thing I've ever done, I think. You basically get to fly and float completely weightless, but you shouldn't be too squeamish because well, a lot of people get sick. This plane is also called the Vomit Comet. So that's it. Are you ready to go to space? And do you have any questions?
Thank you very, very much, Suzanna. This was really, really nice. We have some people from Athens, from Bremen, from Turkey, from France. We have we have a 6-year-old girl from I don't know where she's from actually, but she wants to be a scientist, and her name is Kate. So what will you tell to Kate? She's 6 years old and she already wants to be a scientist. This is wonderful.
Wow, I think you know what you want a lot better than I did when I was 6 years old. So I think if you want to be a scientist, that's great. You should go for it. And I mean, science is a very big field. So maybe you don't know what kind of a scientist you want to be. Maybe you want to be a biologist, or maybe you want to be a physicist, or maybe you want to be an astronaut. But whatever it is, I think stick at it. And maybe in school, you will find out which kind of science you like and what interests you. So just stay curious and stick at it.
Thank you very much. I there was a little a problem with the volume of the numbers you were
Oh,
the exercise. The volume wasn't apparently high enough for everybody. But maybe we can just re-explain a little what consists the exercise. What was the exercise about?
yeah. So, oh, that's a shame because here it was very loud, but I guess it somehow didn't work with the transmission. So basically the exercise was that you hear, which is why I spoke it and I didn't show it to you. You hear a list of numbers and then you have to memorize them. So you have to remember this long list of numbers, but rather than just repeating the numbers, so you just remember the first 5 numbers, you have to repeat them backwards and you don't know where the list of numbers is going to stop. So basically, you can just record the way I practiced it is I recorded rows of numbers for myself, and then I just practiced how many of them I managed to repeat backwards.
And why is that something important for an astronaut?
It's just testing one of the skills that you need. So during the selection process, the point was to test whether we had the mental capabilities to be an astronaut. So there were many tests. This was memory, right? It was just your memory to make sure that if you're told to do something, for example, over voice from ground control in Houston, that you don't just forget it, but that you can remember it and you can actually do several things without forgetting them. So that's why it's important.
Thank you, thank you. And is there like astronaut games? Other astronaut games like you can play in the International Space Station?
You mean for the astronauts, or you mean like how it feels to be an astronaut? So the astronauts don't have very much time for themselves, unfortunately. So normally the working day is like 6.5 hours. You have to do 2 hours of sport. It's really important to have 2 hours of sport. And then normally you have public relation activities in addition to that. So you'll be on social media, for example, sharing your experiences or talking to school kids or to people on Earth. So we really don't have that much time. We're certainly not bored up in space. And actually, if you do have a moment, the coolest thing is just to sit by the window and watch Earth go by. So I think no astronaut needs anything else than that.
Do you take some books or you have like electronic books, things like that? No.
So the personal allowance for an astronaut is only 500 grams.
500 grams?
Yes, for personal things. So yeah, you wouldn't really take a book. But of course there is, I mean, you have iPads up there, for example, you have laptops, so you could always download books. And in fact, you can they send up books and movies as well, in case astronauts did get bored at some time.
Oh, Katerina, 6 years old, she's asking, how do you jump from a rocket to the moon?
Oh, okay. So ideally you don't jump because you need a spacesuit. And if you just jump from the rocket to the moon, I think you would end up hurting yourself very, very badly. So what they did when they went to the moon, the astronauts, they had basically a spacecraft that went, because the moon is very far away. I know it looks quite close if you look up in the sky, but it's very, very far away. So they took the rocket and they flew all the way to the moon until they were just around the moon, just above the surface. And then they had a special spacecraft that they got inside, and that detached from the orbiting spacecraft, and they kind of went down to the moon using booster rockets so they wouldn't fall too quickly. So you never just jump out of the rockets. That would be a very, very bad idea. You always want to stay in the rocket. It's like jumping out of a plane. That would also not be a good idea.
But once they were on the moon, they did like do some jumping in the moon, no?
Yes, and once you land, you can get out. And of course, on the International Space Station as well, you have spacewalks. So you can go out, but you have to have a proper suit. And of course, if you just jumped from the rocket onto the moon, the crash would not be
not
so good.
But once you're on the moon, you're walking on the moon, you can jump, and your jumps are really like high, no? because of
Yes,
gravity,
so actually that was one thing during the diving training, we actually practiced that because underwater you're a lot lighter, right, than you are on Earth. And we had some weights in our shoes that were exactly right so that we felt as if we were on the moon, because the moon has less gravity than the Earth. And then basically we could jump very far. Yeah, so you're kind of hopping around. You just take one step and you're hopping. It's kind of fun.
Excellent, excellent. So what Kimon from Greece, from I think he's the one from Athens, no? Yes, he's, thank you, great presentation, he says. Thank you very much. Which is the maximum, what is the maximum age that someone will start to think to try to be an astronaut?
Okay, so for the selection, they say that there is no specific maximum age, but the best age is between 27 and 37 for the selection. But they have had people much older than that in space. I mean, in their 50s, 60s even. So in a way, as long as you're healthy, that is the main thing. There is no real age limit to go into space.
There is no like minimum age to be a candidate?
I mean, I think probably you have to be 18 right now. But the minimum age, well, they say between 27 and 37 is the ideal age, because they're looking for scientists and pilots. So they're looking for people that have finished their study. So you can't just go out of school and become an astronaut. You need to have studied something.
Okay. And in that way, what will be the best professions? Like,
it's really difficult to say because, as I said, there's basically the three ways to become an astronaut are science, and it doesn't really matter what science. So I met lots of the other astronaut candidates and lots of the other astronauts, and they're all kinds of things. There's like geophysicists, meteorologists. I'm an astronomer. There are engineers. There are pilots. So I think the best thing is, if you want to be a scientist, study whichever science you think is most interesting. And I think it doesn't really matter for becoming an astronaut. It's much more important to be really passionate and good at what you do, rather than choosing one particular science.
thank you. And Henda from France asked how you can measure the redshift of stars and galaxies. This is a completely different subject, but you can help her anyway.
I can help you. So basically, that's quite an advanced question, actually. I assume you're not 6 years old. So basically, redshift is caused by the fact that the universe is expanding, and things that are further away from us are moving away from us, which basically means if you have, you can imagine the light that we're getting from the star or the galaxy or whatever as kind of a wave like this. And the wave is basically stretched, which means it becomes redder. That's the way it works in physics. If you have a longer wavelength, so your wave is stretched, you become redder. So that's why it's called redshift. So the light, basically the color of the light is kind of shifted towards the red. And depending on how much it is shifted towards the red, you can determine how far away the object is.
Okay, so Nelsie is clapping hands for you.
That's nice.
Thank you,
Thank
Nelsie.
you.
Do you have any other question, guys, from the comments? Let's see. Let's give some minutes. Probably kids can be trying to ask things. Anyway, I think while we wait a little, it's very interesting how maybe a good message is the one you said the other day, is that don't if you want to be an astronaut, try to be the best scientist, the best you, and then if it happens to be an astronaut, then you're going to be a happy astronaut. But it's very difficult to be selected. Maybe you can explain that a little, no?
Yeah, so I think that it's very, very difficult to become an astronaut because there are just not very many seats in the rockets, and there's not many rockets going up. So you can, you know, study as much as you want, and you can just be not lucky and not become an astronaut. So I think this is really important, that the main thing is to just be happy with whatever you're doing first. And then if you can become an astronaut, of course, that's a bonus. But you can never really have that as your main career choice, just because, yeah, you need something else to make you happy, I think.
Okay, when Quraish asked, when do you expect to go to the International Space Station?
Yeah, so we're not sure yet. Basically, the plan now is 2021. So next year, about a year and a half probably from now. But with Corona, we need to see what's going to happen, because the financing, we don't have all the financing yet. And due to the coronavirus and the situation, it's obviously getting a bit more complicated right now. And the other thing is that we're now waiting for SpaceX, who I now just today heard are going to do their final tests. So they're going to send astronauts to the space station they're launching on May 27th. So in about a month's time, and we have to wait and see how that goes. So we're really keeping our fingers crossed that this goes well and they can launch, and then we'll see, hopefully by the end of next year.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so I think we can finish here because of the time also.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Suzanna, for joining us today. This evening for you, this midday for us almost, and this morning for some people over there. So I hope you enjoyed this activity as much as I did. And we're starting in about 20 minutes a Spanish kids activity over the Instagram live of ALMA. So I meet you there if you speak Spanish and you want to join us. It's going to be a storytelling from another astronomer. And there is a big hug from Bonn, from Rebecca.
Bonn. From who?
Rebecca.
Rebecca, okay.
Rebecca Aladro.
Ah, okay. Yes.
And
big hug back.
and you have she's hearing you. Okay, so goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you.